Snow had covered Winteridge like a shroud. The roads, the rooftops, even the crooked fences were blanketed in white silence, as if the entire town had made a pact to forget. But some things couldn't be buried so easily. Not shame, not hunger, and certainly not a widow with 2 starving children. She walked with slow, deliberate steps, her arms curled around their small bodies. The girl, Lila, no older than 8, coughed behind a scarf that had long lost its warmth. The boy, Eli, barely 5, whimpered with every step, too cold to speak. They looked like shadows drifting through the snow, their forms barely more solid than the misty breath that floated from their lips. People saw them, from behind windows, from shop doors, but no one stepped outside. She approached the general store first, holding her son with one arm and knocking with the other. The shopkeeper, Mr. Granger, looked through the frosted pane. Their eyes met. He held the stare for a moment, then reached up and flipped the sign to closed. She stayed there, unmoving. Another moment, her hand still raised. Then she lowered it slowly, adjusted her shawl, and walked on. At the chapel, the heavy oak doors did not open. Not even the pastor, who once blessed her wedding, came to answer. When her husband died, branded a liar and a thief by the sheriff, so too died any kindness the town had once shown. No one spoke his name anymore. No one left flowers at his grave. He was buried behind the church in a shallow pit, dug into frozen earth, and with him they buried her dignity. The saloon doors creaked as she passed. A man inside laughed too loudly, the sound sharp against the cold. No one looked her way, not even the woman who used to lend her bread on Sundays. By the time she reached the end of Main Street, her daughter was stumbling. The boy clung to her like a second skin. Her fingers, numb and cracked, trembled as she lifted Lila onto her hip and pressed forward. The snow grew thicker, swirling like ghosts around them. Beyond the edge of town stood an old barn near the creek. It had belonged to a rancher who vanished one winter and never returned. Rumors said wolves got him, others said the sheriff did, but no one claimed the land. She pushed the door open. It moaned but gave way. Inside it was dark and bitter cold, but at least there was shelter from the wind. She cleared a patch of old straw in the corner and lay the children down. She took off her coat, threadbare as it was, and wrapped it around their small bodies. Then she sat against the wall, arms around them both, and stared into the dark. She didn't cry, she didn't beg. Whatever God ruled Winteridge had long since closed his ears. Hours passed. The wind cried through the trees and snow slipped through the cracks in the wood. But the children slept, huddled together beneath her skirt. Outside, in the thick trees beyond the creek, someone stood motionless in the shadows. A tall figure in a heavy coat, fur-lined hood pulled low, axe slung over one shoulder. His breath steamed in the moonlight, but he didn't step forward. He simply watched, and when the wind died down and the crying stopped, he turned and walked silently back into the woods. Morning came without light, just a dull gray hue that filtered through the barn's broken slats, announcing another day of cold survival. The widow opened her eyes slowly, her body aching from the position she'd held all night. Arms wrapped tight around her children, knees drawn in, back pressed against rough wooden boards. Her breath came out in clouds. The girl still slept. The boy moaned softly, clutching his stomach. She knew the sound too well. Hunger had become a second heartbeat in their small family, constant, desperate, and growing louder. They had eaten nothing the day before. The last crust of bread had been gone 2 sunsets ago, and all she had left now were a few frozen berries in her pocket, picked from a bush near the creek a week back. She split them between the children, 1 berry each. Her own lips remained closed. She kissed their foreheads and whispered a promise she no longer believed in. Then she stepped into the snow alone. The town was quiet that morning. Not even the church bell rang. Her boots left sharp prints in the fresh powder as she walked back over the frozen bridge. Her fingers throbbed with cold. Her lips had cracked and bled during the night. She kept her chin high as she returned to the general store, but her eyes no longer looked through the window. She went straight to the back near the alley and waited. Minutes passed. Then the door creaked open. "I told you not to come here anymore," Mr. Granger said without stepping outside. "I'll trade," she said simply. Her voice was hoarse from the cold. He scoffed. "You don't have nothing left worth trading." She reached into the folds of her coat and pulled out a small object, wrapped in cloth. A silver ring, her wedding band. She unwrapped it and held it in the flat of her palm. "This was my mother's before. It was mine." Phelps stared at it, then at her. Finally he stepped out, snatched it from her hand, and dropped a small stale loaf into her other. "You didn't get this from me," he muttered, and shut the door. She stood in the alley, for a moment, staring at the bread. It was hard as stone, days old, but it was food. She tucked it beneath her shawl and hurried back. By the time she returned to the barn, the boy had vomited bile and Lila was crying quietly, her lips blue. The widow broke the bread into 3 pieces. She dipped hers in melted snow, chewing slowly so the children wouldn't see how difficult it was to swallow. Later, as they slept, she stared at the ringless finger on her hand. The weight of loss, humiliation, and helplessness settled over her like a second snowfall. She had traded her last symbol of love for a loaf of bread that would be gone by nightfall. Still, the children were warm now, fed for the moment, and that, she told herself, was enough. But when she stepped out to gather firewood, twigs, really, fallen branches from the edge of the trees, she noticed something strange. Big footprints, deeper than hers, leading up to the barn but not away from it. She turned to look around but saw nothing, just endless snow and the thick shadow of pine trees. Back inside the barn, she moved the children close to her and didn't speak. Not about the prints, not about the cold, not about the gnawing fear or the strange weight that was slowly shifting in her chest. Strange weight that was slowly shifting in her chest. Something had changed. She didn't know it yet, but someone had seen her and in silence, had begun to act. Dawn broke with a fierce wind that howled across the hills and swept snow into the barn like an uninvited guest. The widow sat upright, her arms around the children, her body stiff from sleeping on straw and frozen wood. The loaf of bread was gone. Lila had kept hers in her lap for hours before, nibbling. The boy had eaten silently as if afraid it might disappear. Now both children slept again, their breathing shallow but even. She eased out from beneath them and stepped outside into the bitter morning. She needed kindling, something, anything, and that's when she saw it. Lying just outside the barn door was a small bundle, wrapped in burlap, and tied with leather cord. She stared for a moment, unsure whether to approach. No one had knocked, no sound had come to rouse her, but someone had been here. Her hands trembled as she untied the cord. Inside were rough chunks of smoked meat, dried apples, and God above, a block of lard-wrapped cornbread. At the bottom, a thin wool blanket. No note, no signature, just mercy. Her knees buckled and she sank to the ground, not from weakness but from the weight of it all. The kindness, the mystery, the disbelief. She looked up at the woods, eyes scanning the trees. No movement, but then she saw them. Tracks, footprints. Large, firm, pressed deep into the snow. They led away from the barn, crossing the creek and vanishing into the dark pine forest. They hadn't been there the day before and they weren't her own. She stood and followed them a few steps before stopping herself. Whoever had left the food didn't want to be known. She could feel it in the careful distance between each print, the quiet with which they'd come and gone. Back inside, she wrapped the children in the new blanket and let the scent of smoked meat stir them awake. The boy's eyes lit up. Lila whispered, "Mama, is it Christmas?" "No," she said softly, brushing her daughter's hair back. "But it feels like a miracle just the same." They ate slowly. She rationed every bite, letting them have more than herself. As they chewed, she stared at the barn door, mind racing. Who had brought the bundle? Why? No one in Winterridge would dare. Not for her. Not now. That night she didn't sleep. She waited beside the door, ears straining for any sound beyond. Once or twice she thought she heard footsteps, but when she opened the door, the world was empty again. On the third morning, another bundle appeared. This time it held chopped firewood stacked neatly, another blanket, and a small tin of lye soap. She wept. There was care in every item. Purpose. No charity from a distance. This was different. Quiet. Consistent. And deliberate. She stepped out into the snow once more and followed the tracks a bit farther this time. They crossed the creek, climbed a narrow hill, and disappeared into the dense forest. That evening she whispered a thank you into the trees. No answer came, but deep in the woods a man sat beside his own fire. His cabin was built of old pine logs, nearly invisible beneath the snow. He placed his hands near the flames, then glanced toward a small carving on the mantel. A woman's face, shaped in soft curves, long gone but never forgotten. He didn't smile, he didn't speak, but he rose. And the next bundle he packed was larger than the last. The forest loomed larger with each step. She hadn't meant to go far. At first it was just curiosity, gratitude tugging at her ribs. But after the third morning, when she found an entire satchel filled with flour, salt, and even a jar of preserved peaches, something shifted. This wasn't random charity. This was care, purposeful and silent. She wrapped the children in the wool blankets and tucked the last of the bread beneath their arms. kissing their heads before stepping into the cold. The snowfall had eased, the wind calmer. She followed the footprints again now, more familiar, almost trusted. They passed the edge of the creek, veered up the hill and wove into a stretch of dense pines where the light barely reached the ground. Each tree stood like a sentinel, tall and unmoving. As she pressed deeper into the woods, her breath turned sharp, her fingers even gloved began to sting. Then she saw it, a small cabin, half hidden beneath the heavy boughs of evergreens. Its chimney was dark stone, freshly repaired. Smoke curled from the top, thin, straight, steady. There was a split log bench beside the door and stacked wood piled shoulder high along the wall. No lantern, no signs of horses or wagons, just stillness. She approached slowly. At the door she raised her hand to knock, then hesitated. What would she say? Who was he? Why had he? The door creaked open before she touched it. Inside stood a man, broad shoulders, heavy coat, beard thick with streaks of gray. His eyes were dark, unreadable. He didn't flinch, didn't speak, just looked at her as if he'd expected her all along. I followed your tracks, she said, her voice trembling from more than just the cold. You've been leaving food for us. Still, he said nothing. He simply stepped back into the cabin and turned away, leaving the door wide open. She lingered a moment, uncertain, then crossed the threshold. The warmth struck her like a memory. A fire crackled in a stone hearth. The cabin was modest. One room, a table with rough-hewn chairs, a pot simmering above the flames. Two beds on either side made with heavy wool quilts. On the far wall hung a carved cross, simple and unadorned. He motioned toward the fire without a word. She stepped forward slowly, heart racing. My children, she began, but he shook his head gently, pointed toward a folded cloth on the table. Inside it were dried berries, a small loaf and 2 jars of goat's milk, enough for them both. Then he pointed to the pot. Soup, rich with potatoes and venison. He ladled some into a wooden bowl and set it on the table for her. Still not a word. She sat watching him from the corner of her eye as she ate. He moved with purpose, chopping kindling by the hearth, checking the pot, cleaning a hunting knife with a cloth worn thin at the edges. His silence was comforting. It was deep, like a well no one had drawn from in years. When she finished, she rose. I should go, she said quietly. My children are alone. He stepped past her, reached into a large sack near the door and pulled out another blanket and a pouch of jerky. Then he looked her in the eye for the first time, not with pity, not with curiosity, but with something older, like understanding. He handed her the items and opened the door. She stepped into the cold with her arms full of warmth, arms full of food, warmth spreading through her chest faster than her fingers could feel it. She paused once more, looked over her shoulder. What's your name? She asked. He didn't answer, didn't nod, didn't close the door, just watched her go as silent as the trees. From that day on, the woods became part of her morning ritual. Each dawn, after feeding the children what little they had, she would leave them bundled in blankets inside the barn and make her way to the cabin. She no longer feared the man who lived there. His silence, once unsettling, now offered something she hadn't known in months. Safety, no questions, no judgment, just quiet provision. He never asked why she came. He never looked surprised to see her. When she arrived, he would push the cabin door open, ladle soup into a bowl and return to his carving or chopping or sewing by the hearth. Some days he left fresh bread on the bench outside, knowing she might not come. Other days, he would send her home with tins of lard, soap, or soft leather scraps for the children's shoes. He didn't speak, not even once, but he did communicate. When her daughter grew ill with a cough that would not go away, she found a bundle on the bench with pine needles, peppermint and a small cloth bag of dried honey root. She boiled them into tea as instructed on a scrap of paper with simple drawings. Boil, steep, serve warm. Lila began to breathe easier by the second night. When Eli tore his hand on a nail, she returned to the cabin in panic. The woodsman didn't flinch. He took the boy's hand in his massive ones, cleaned the wound gently and wrapped it with a salve that smelled of wintergreen. Then, with one quiet nod, he handed her a jar of the ointment. No words, just care. And something deeper than kindness. He began teaching the children in his own way. Without speaking, he'd show Eli how to sharpen kindling with a small blade, dulled for safety. He'd hand Lila a piece of wood and a whittling tool and trace lines with her fingers, to show her how to follow the grain. When they carved a bird together, Lila laughed for the first time in weeks. The sound made the widow press a hand to her chest to keep from breaking open. The man built things. He repaired the barn door without her asking. One morning, a rocking chair appeared inside, rough, sturdy, shaped by hand. Another morning, a full set of shelves nailed into the wall stocked with dried beans and flour. She hadn't heard him come or go. He left no trace, only comfort. He was a woodsman by trade, but more than that, he was a caretaker of silence. He moved through the world with a stillness that soothed rather than startled. He made no demands. He took nothing in return, and yet she began to give. Not with money, she had none, but with trust. She brought him a small tin of biscuits she'd managed to bake over the fire. She patched a tear in his coat. Once, she placed a tiny wooden cross carved by Lila on the bench outside the cabin. He didn't acknowledge it, but the next time she came, it was gone from the bench and resting above the fireplace beside a worn leather pouch and an old locket. She never asked about the locket, never dared, but sometimes when he thought no one was looking, he'd take it in his hands and stare at it long after the fire had burned low. Days turned into weeks. Winter crept deeper into the land. The town remained silent. The church doors stayed closed. But in the forest among the pines and snow, a quiet bond was forming. One carved slowly, deliberately, like the beams of a home being built not of wood but of presence. It had been nearly a month since the widow last walked Winteridge's main street. In that time, snow had deepened and rumors had thickened, drifting through the town faster than any wind. The general store saw fewer customers now, but the conversations inside grew sharper, hushed with a purpose. Eyes narrowed, tongues wagged behind gloved hands. "She's living out there with a man," Mrs. Harlow whispered over a bolt of fabric. "Some say he's not even white," added another, shaking her head. "Could be a savage, could be worse." The pastor's wife pursed her lips and crossed herself. Children in that kind of environment. It's unnatural. Behind the bar, old Dake polished a glass and said nothing, but listen. Everyone listened. The widow, once ignored, had become a story, a caution, a scandal. No one in town had seen her face in weeks. Yet they spoke of her as if she were the only thing that mattered. It wasn't just her disappearance that stirred the fire. It was the silence surrounding it. No one had seen her beg. No one had seen her starve. No one had seen her die, and in Winteridge, when a woman vanished without permission, people demanded a reason. The sheriff, Andrew Maddox, heard the talk too. He had ignored it at first. He had more pressing matters, like rationing ammunition and keeping the saloon brawls from turning fatal. But the name kept returning. That widow, the one whose husband he'd handled months prior. The one buried behind the chapel with no service, no She's being kept by someone, a rancher told him one morning. Out near the ridge. A cabin maybe. Big fella, doesn't come into town. The sheriff said nothing at first, just nodded. But something in him stirred. Guilt? No, that had died with the man in the snow. Possession, perhaps. Or pride. By the next morning, Briggs saddled his horse and took 2 deputies with him. They rode slow at first, tracking prints through the snow. Deep boots, heavy steps, heading north, just as the whispers said. Meanwhile in the forest, the widow was boiling potatoes when she heard the sound. Distant but sharp. Hooves, 3 horses. Her heart clenched. The woodsman was sharpening an axe behind the cabin. She rushed outside. "Someone's coming," she said. Her voice was thin with fear. He stopped, looked at her, then calmly placed the axe on the bench. She tried to explain. "It's the sheriff. He'll take the children. He'll say I'm unfit, that I've sinned. They'll call you a thief. Or worse." The man didn't speak. He turned, stepped into the cabin, and pulled down a long rifle from above the door. But he didn't load it, didn't raise it, just held it. The widow grabbed his sleeve. "Please, don't hurt anyone." He nodded once, then stood by the deodorant, waiting. Back in town, the gossip reached a fever pitch. "She's bewitched him," one woman said. "No man does that much for a widow without being caught under some spell." The pastor, in his Sunday sermon, mentioned the dangers of unchaperoned women and unholy unions beneath the trees. No names, of course, but everyone understood. Only one person dared speak in her defense. A frail man named Jonas, who once served beside her late husband in the war. He mumbled over his coffee. "If she's alive, warm, and the children are fed, maybe it's not sin. Maybe it's salvation." But few heard him. The noise of judgment was louder than any whisper of grace, and it was riding toward the cabin, one hoofbeat at a time. The storm rolled in before the riders did. It began with a wind that howled through the pines like a living thing, restless, wounded, and cold as judgment. Snow followed fast, angry and thick, swallowing the forest floor and muting every sound beneath its weight. By the time the gathering kindled, the sky had turned the color of steel, and Lila was coughing hard again. She rushed to the girl's side, her forehead burned beneath cold skin. Her breathing came ragged. Eli sat silently at her feet, eyes wide with fear, as if his sister's sickness could break the fragile rhythm of their new life. The woodsman was already moving. He set down the chair leg he'd been carving and opened a cedar chest in the corner. From inside, he pulled a pouch of dried herbs and a chipped teacup. then pointed to the kettle already steaming above the fire. She knelt beside him, watching as he crumbled the herbs into the pot. A sharp smell filled the cabin. Peppermint, pine resin, and something bitter she didn't recognize. He poured the mixture into the cup and handed it to her with steady hands. "She can't keep anything down," the widow said, her voice shaking. He dipped a cloth into the warm liquid and handed it to her. She pressed it to Lila's lips. The girl whimpered, then sipped. The woodsman turned away and began stoking the fire harder, feeding it thick logs, building heat. Then he left, without a word, vanishing into the storm. She called after him, but the wind swallowed her voice. Hours passed. The blizzard raged against the cabin walls, shaking the shutters like angry fists. The boy cried once, but the widow hushed him, holding both children tight. Lila burned and shivered. The cloth was soaked with sweat. The fire crackled, but no longer comfort. Just as dusk fell, the door slammed open. The woodsman stepped inside, his coat white with snow, beard frozen. In his arms were bundles, pine branches thick as his forearms, and 3 small bottles tied in a leather thong. He set them down and got to work. The liquid inside the bottles smelled sharp and medicinal. He added drops to the tea, wrapped Lila in pine-soaked cloths, then placed heated stones near her feet beneath the blanket. The widow didn't ask what it was. She only watched, trusted. Night fell. The storm grew quieter, replaced by the soft rattle of wind-blown ice against the window. Then finally, Lila slept, still feverish, but calm. Her breathing deepened. The color returned to her lips. The widow sat back on the floor, utterly still. She looked at the man sitting across from her, his hands now raw from chopping and boiling and carrying. "You saved her," she whispered. He didn't nod, didn't speak, just sat there, elbows on knees staring into the fire. She rose slowly, crossed the room and placed a hand on his shoulder. It was the first time she'd touched him. He tensed for a moment, then relaxed. No words passed between them, but something else did. Later, when the children were asleep and the fire had died to embers, she stood near the window and watched the snow fall slow. Her breath fogged the glass. In the reflection she saw the man behind her still sitting, staring into nothing. Not broken, not lost, just silent. And for the first time she didn't feel alone in it. The days after the storm passed slowly, like breath returning to a body that had forgotten how to breathe. Lila's fever broke completely on the 3rd morning. Her cheeks, once pale as milk, now flushed with soft color. She spoke more, even smiled. Eli followed her laughter like sunlight, and the widow, though still weary, felt something warm rising in her chest. Not just relief, hope. She watched them from the window, bundled in layers, gathering pine cones beneath the low-hanging branches. The woodsman had carved them tiny sleds from bark and sticks, and though crude, they rode them down the slight slope outside the cabin with wild delight. Inside, the widow washed clothes by hand. The man had brought her a basin and blocks of soap, lavender scented from who knows where. She wanted to ask how he came by such things, but she had learned. In his silence, there was always purpose. Still, some questions clung to her ribs like thorns. That night she couldn't sleep. The wind had stilled. The moon was full, casting silver light over the snow like a veil. She wrapped herself in her coat and stepped outside. The forest didn't frighten her anymore. The dark no longer whispered threats. There was something sacred in this quiet. She walked aimlessly at first, boots crunching softly, letting her thoughts rise. Then something in the snow caught her eye, a thin wooden shape poking up. Near a tree line she moved close. A cross, simple, weather-worn, its arms tied with twine. At the base, a scattering of old wildflowers now frozen. She crouched and brushed snow from the wooden plank. A name was carved faintly into the grain. Hannah. No last name, no date, just that. Her breath caught in her throat. The letters were careful, almost reverent. She looked around. No other markers, no graveyard, just this lone cross buried at the edge of the woods. The widow sat back on her heels, hands in her lap, letting the stillness speak. Now she understood the locket, the firelight in his eyes when the children laughed, the way he looked at her, never as if she were someone new but someone remembered. This was his grave, his grief, his silence. She didn't cry, not there. She reached into her coat, pulled out a ribbon from Lila's hair, blue and faded, and tied it gently around the cross. Then, standing slowly, she whispered, "She must have been loved." Behind her, snow crunched. She turned. He was there, standing a few feet away. His coat was unbuttoned as if he'd followed her in haste. His eyes didn't blink. He looked at the cross, then at her. Their breath met in the cold between them. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't mean to intrude." He shook his head once. Then he stepped forward, just enough to kneel beside the cross. He reached out, touched the ribbon lightly, with calloused fingers, and left his hand there a moment too long. She knelt beside him, not close enough to touch, but close enough to share the silence. The snow began to fall again, light as dust. They stayed there for a long time,